We're really honoured to have you welcome us to Gadigal land today. And I too would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. In our work as professional storytellers and communicators, we aim to take their spirit into everything that we do. So, good morning and welcome to the Edelman Trust Barometer launch, everybody. My name is Lillian Morrison. I'm an account director in our Sydney team, and on behalf of Edelman, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. So it still feels surreal, I'm not sure if anyone else feels this way, that it's been 3 years since we have gathered for such an occasion in person. I actually joined Edelman 4 years ago, and during this time, I've had the chance to see our trust data really evolve over time. I've worked with clients to address and mitigate the challenges that they are experiencing as a result of declining trust levels and the changing expectations of the roles of business and government. In parallel to this, in my non-PR life, I've experienced some of the most life-changing moments and have witnessed the influence that trust, or lack thereof, has had on my decisions, my finances, and my perceptions of the world. So as someone that was recently married, bought a house and a fur baby all within the last 2 years, I have experienced some of the trials and tribulations that are facing young people today. So whilst we have many experts lined up today to take you through the findings of this year's trust data and what it means for business and society, my role is slightly different. As the youngest person that you'll hear from today, I hope to speak to the perspectives, the hopes and the fears of our younger generation. You're going to hear a lot today about trust through the lens of Australia's younger generations and why their voices are important. At the core, trust is a long-term game. What you'll see today is that younger Australians are keen for change, and some of that will hopefully begin with the people that are in the room today. We all, I'm sure, know that just yesterday, interest rates increased again off the back of the highest inflation rates that we've been seeing since the 90s. So as someone that locked in a fixed interest rate 2 years ago, I'm expecting, like many other Aussies, to be facing an entirely new reality in the coming months. Many of my friends are struggling to get into the housing market, and those that are frantically trying to keep their head above water. I hope I'm not the only one. With rising interest rates and mortgage stress, the huge cost of living pressures, global conflict, personal stress about our own health and safety, and the ever-present influence of social media on our perceptions of the world and success, there is a lot going on in the minds of young Australians. Trust is eroding, and the younger generations are bearing the brunt. At the core, today's trust data will present a simple truth, that there is commonality in humanity. The factors that are affecting my day-to-day life are being universally felt, from the lowest income earners up to Australia's top 1%. And when I reflect on the experiences and what this data means for me, I really have to be hopeful. I have to be hopeful that despite all that is going on in the world, that with concerted action, we still have the ability to correct our trust course and to work towards hope and unity. So today, we invite you to view the trust findings through the lens of the future workforce and the future leaders of this nation. We invite you to consider and question how businesses and business leaders can help shape a positive future for us. Today, Michelle Hutton will present this year's Trust Barometer findings, and will then be joined by our incredible group of panellists for what I'm sure will be an energetic conversation on how business leaders can implement the findings of trust to better their businesses and our community. So, on our panel today, we have Chief Executive Officer of First Nations Media, Professor Shane O'Hearn. We have Non-Executive Director at Atomos, Megan Brownlow. Head of Sustainability for Qantas, Andrew Parker, and founder of Media Diversity Australia, Antoinette Lattouf. So, now we invite you to take a look back at the year that was, and then I would like to please welcome Vice Chair of Edelman's Asia Pacific region, Michelle Hutton.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Hutton, the Vice Chair of Edelman APAC, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here today for our first in-person Trust Barometer event since 2020. Each year, we look to the barometer to give us a sense of what business leaders need to tackle for the year ahead. And over the last few years, we've seen seismic changes in how and who we trust in Australia, and this year is no different. We're all hoping that 2022 would be the year that we would emerge from the pandemic, return to a normal life and a new business rhythm. But what we faced here and around the world was very, very different. Before we dive in, just a few notes on our study. Edelman is a global communications business, and we've been studying trust now for 23 years, exploring how and why people trust the institutions of business, government, media, and NGOs to do the right thing. Our global study is based on an online survey of 32,000 respondents in 28 countries in the month of November 2022. The Australian sample of 1,150 is reflective of our general population. In over 2 decades of research, we've documented many trends in trust across the globe, from shifts in trust from authorities to peers to crises of transparency and disinformation. And all of this and more has led us to where we are today around the world, deeply polarised. We all feel it, but especially our younger generation. As employees, customers, voters, neighbours, family, friends, rather than celebrating our differences, we are all doing the opposite. And the very social fabric that in the past has helped bring Australians together needs urgent attention to course correct. So what's driving the polarisation? A number of forces are at play around the world, growing, and real worries about cost of living and future economic prosperity, the increasing void between our trust in business and trust in government, the mass class wealth gap, and a battle for truth in the disinformation age. Keep these all in mind as we go through the data. So let's jump in. First, let's start with the big picture, look at trust around the world. Here you see the trust index for each country, which is an average of trust in the 4 institutions. Last year's data and this year's data side by side. For the second year in a row, Australia saw one of the biggest drops in trust anywhere in the world, with a drop of 5 points on the trust index. Australia now joins the US, UK, Japan, and South Korea in distrusting territory. Let's unpack this. In Australia, all 4 institutions saw a downturn in trust and none are trusted. As was the case last year, business in Australia remains our most trusted institution despite still being in neutral territory, with 54 points. NGOs remain in second position, with government seeing a 7-point drop to position number 3, and media continues to be the most distrusted institution in Australia, down 5 points from the year prior. Now, we refer to the institution of government in the Trust Barometer and not individual parties or politicians. But some of the big shifts at play in Australia in the federal election, particularly from first-time voters, would have impacted these results. And the swing to the Greens in key seats in the now well-known Teal independents gave us some insight into how the priorities of younger Australians are beginning to impact the shape of government. In fact, their impact is felt even more widely. It was these 2 groups, Gen Z and high-income earners, that drove the downturn in trust in Australia. Let's look at both more closely. We see the generational picture more clearly when we break this down into our 4 generations, Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, and Boomers. Millennials emerge as the most trusting generation in Australia for the second year in a row. But you can see here, Gen Z are the least trusting, and by some way. We know that they are the most belief-driven buyers. They come together to make change. They trust those close to them. They trust experts, but know that they will always search and they will always find the truth. Know that the generational divide in Australia is real and continues to get bigger. And here's something to consider. Millennials, the next generation of Australian leaders waiting in the wings, are more inclined to trust than the generation that will succeed them. The other major group driving the trust decline in Australia was the high income earners. Each year we look at the trust inequality between the high and the low income earners in Australia, and we can now see a trend. Look at the drop in trust with high income earners since the peak of the pandemic in our 2021 study. And trust with low income earners has remained relatively steady over the last year. Now the inequality gap in trust has closed to just 11 points. It has more than halved over the last 3 years. And it's clear that nobody is immune from the current economic and existential challenges we're facing. Each year, our sector split also paints a really important picture. So take note. As we turn an eye to business by industry, you can see here that the national decline in trust has also been felt across most of our industry sectors. And while this headline is a little deflating, the good news is that we still have 9 sectors trusted and 4 in neutral territory. Healthcare, education, and F&B continue to be the most trusted sectors in Australia. And this year we saw the fashion and energy sectors enter distrust territory, perhaps both affected by inflationary pressures and the tougher scrutiny of their sustainable business practices. Each year we also look at what's keeping Australians up at night. And this year there are some new additions, and we've seen them across the globe. Job loss continues to be the Australians' #1 fear, with concerns about increasing inflation not far behind. And yesterday's 9th consecutive interest rate hike in Australia will continue to add to household pressures. But this year we see some fairly significant new fears starting to emerge, with nuclear war and climate change beginning to rival those challenges that are closer to home. This year also sees the inclusion of energy and food shortages, with soaring energy prices and cost of living pressures affecting people every day. With all of these fears, we now see a significant drop in economic optimism in Australia. We asked people all around the world if they thought they and their family would be better off in 5 years' time. And what we found was stunning. Economic optimism in 24 of 28 countries is at an all-time low, which includes every developed market in the world, including Australia. So where are Australians placing their trust? Well, it seems trust now really does start at home, or at work, it would seem, as trust is as local as ever. We are more willing to trust those around us. Traditional authority leaders continue to face significant drops in trust in Australia, with journalists, CEOs, and government leaders all distrusted. And globally, these leaders are all distrusted. While my co-workers, people in my community, scientists, and my CEO all remain highly trusted. The most trusted source of information of all are my co-workers. And this is the second year in a row that we trust the people we work with more than any traditional authority figure. And it's no wonder we see polarisation in Australia. When we looked at whether we trust in the 4 institutions to provide trustworthy information, we found that media and government are fueling a cycle of distrust. In Australia, respondents said that both business and NGOs are more trustworthy because they are less likely to be seen as sources of false information. Comparatively, government and media, traditionally the guardians of information, are seen as providing false or misleading information. Let's take a closer look at the media sources and which we trust more, remembering that none of them are fully trusted. Search engines are the most trusted media source in Australia, closely followed by traditional media, although both are in neutral trust territory. What's brought the overall trust score down for media is company or brand-owned media and social media platforms that are distrusted. One of this year's major findings is that distrust breeds polarisation, and polarisation is bad for business. And it's bad for society in general. And for a nation like ours, it creates tension, disharmony, division, and imbalance. We first asked people how divided they felt their countries were. We've plotted every country on the grid you see here. The further up the y-axis on our chart, people see more and more division in their countries. Then as we move to the right on the x-axis, those divisions are seen as more entrenched, insurmountable, they can't be overcome. That gives us 3 levels of polarisation, which fall along the diagonals that you see here. In the bottom left, there are less polarised countries where there are fewer divisions seen in society. In the moderately polarised middle, people see deep divisions, but they think they're addressable. And for the severely polarised in the top right, people see deep, deep divisions, and they're unlikely to be overcome. Here are the results by country. This scattered chart shows how the countries fall along those polarisation axes. And you can see that Australia currently sits in the moderately polarised category, but it won't take much for us to move into the most extreme territory if the status quo remains. So, where does polarisation come from? We looked for factors that pushed countries further along our polarisation measures. And you see them listed on the right. Each of these are major contributors, and the biggest are distrust in government and a lack of shared identity, followed by a feeling that the system is just unfair. Also, significant factors are economic pessimism, societal fears, and the distrust in media. The more people hold these views, the more likely they are to see their countries as polarised, that divisions are entrenched. So who's doing the dividing? Australians believe that the rich and powerful, alongside hostile foreign governments, are the biggest dividers. We believe that government leaders, journalists, and business leaders are on the middle tier. And to the right are those seen as the uniters. So this should be a really great opportunity for NGO leaders to step up and help rebuild trust in the system. And finally, by far, teachers. Somewhat alarming, considering the pressures in our education system, but an opportunity nonetheless. Let's take a moment to consider what this division is doing to the social makeup in Australia. Now, these data points are worrying. Just over 60% of Australians we spoke to say that the lack of civility and mutual respect is the worst they've ever seen in this country. Similarly, over half of the people we spoke to believe that the social fabric that used to hold this country together is now too weak. But wait, it gets more interesting. We asked Australians how they would respond if someone disagreed with them on their point of view. And alarmingly, just 24% of people said they'd help them if they were in need. And just 21% said they'd live in the same neighbourhood, or 19% would be willing to have them as a co-worker. Here's the new Australian reality. Polarisation is now so strong that it's governing our personal and our professional relationships. Maybe that's what happens after years of a pandemic where people have been physically isolated and you live in fear for your job, your health, and your future. But regardless, it provides a burning platform. This is not the Australia we know and we love. And with important national discussions and policies on the table for consideration and debate like The Voice, the year ahead needs attention. So where do we go from here? Well, everyone in this room plays a role in rebuilding the currency of trust in Australia. Business remains in a unique position in Australia to solve our trust deficit, as it is the only institution in this country that is seen as both competent and ethical. This graph charts the 4 institutions we track against the 2 primary dimensions of trust: competence, or the ability to get things done, and ethics, or the expectations that you'll do the right thing. On the far right, you'll see the ethics rating for business surged year over year with a 28-point rise from 2020 to 2023. In fact, business now sits just 3 points lower than NGOs. And last year, we considered that this trend showed how business and NGOs in Australia are working, or perhaps compensating, for government's failure. We now ask ourselves, what's driving this ongoing meteoric rise? We think it's here. As with last year, where business enjoys most trust is from its employees, and this equates to 75% in Australia, which is a staggering 30 points clear of government and 37 points above media. Employers all are trusted all around the world. And amidst a lot of turmoil and instability, employers have become seen as a source of trust, stability, and a beacon of hope the world over. And we see that even among those who think their country is polarised, their employer is trusted, the only institution to have that status. And as we take a closer look into businesses and their role in turning the tide on polarisation, we can see that people also overwhelmingly want more engagement from business on a range of societal issues. This is not going away. In Australia, people are 8 times more likely to say that business isn't doing enough on economic inequality, more than 7 times for workforce reskilling, and 7 times for healthcare access, and more than 6 times for energy shortages. Of course, this doesn't translate into a blanket expectation for each company to wade into every societal issue, but recognising where this pressure exists is a helpful guide for choosing when and how to get involved based on a company's context, values, and stakeholder expectations. Balancing this tension between expectations and risk is always a challenge for leaders. So with that, how do we navigate a polarised world? Well, first and foremost, trust must be earned at home. And overwhelmingly, Australians say that CEOs are expected to take a public stand on the treatment of employees, both inside and outside their company, discrimination, the wealth gap, and immigration. Australians have given business leaders a clear mandate. Over 3/4 of people said the CEO voice is expected. But how should business act? When we asked that question, Australians were clear that this isn't a one-person job. It's not for business to act alone or government to act alone. In yesterday's AFR, Allegra Spender was calling for government to listen more to business. So perhaps the tide is already beginning to turn. Let's hope so, because Australians believe that optimal outcomes are 5 times more likely if business and government were to work as partners. So what to do? Be a trustworthy information source. Base what you do on science. Act on the same values over time. Avoid aligning with a single political party and refuse to bend to political pressures. The trust data, as in studies past, are your friend. And the roadmap is pretty clear. In the face of rising inflation, people want fair compensation for employees, properly paid taxes, surety around their community being safe and thriving, and skill training for employees who are displaced by automation and other technologies. And Australians want accountability from business leaders. This year, the majority of people agree that CEOs need to defend facts, pull money from platforms that spread misinformation, and support leaders and media that build consensus and common ground. And finally, brands are given permission to do more. 61% of Australians see the ability for brands to celebrate what brings people together, to emphasise our common interests and strengthen our social fabric. And while we sit below the global average, we can't argue that Australians agree with this statement, especially our Gen Z population. That population is nearly 5 million future customers and employees who are on a course to correct and get Australia and the world back to basics. They want to solve our most glaring issues. They desire and need to know they are safe and their future is secure. They value realism and they buy on beliefs and values, and they are not afraid to act and to use their voice for good. Here's what business leaders can do. Support your home base. Don't go it alone, partner with government. Take a stand, just do it, and empower our young Australians. We started today's session with reflections from this important generation for a reason. They are the least trusting of all of us, but when it is all said and done, they explain the journey of building trust as a simple one, which I like the sound of and I hope you do too. Take care of people. Make me feel safe. And let's unite for change.